Dead Cells is a roguelike. That's it. Review over. No, I'm sorry. Dead Cells is actually a very fast-paced 2D roguelike with some Metroidvania elements, and because of that mix of styles, I was curious to see how it would work, and I was interested in playing this game, but two things stopped me from doing so for a while. One was hearing how hard it was, and given I'm already not particularly good at this type of 2D action games, I was a bit pushed back by that fact, but the biggest thing keeping me away was actually that it released in early access. And as someone who doesn't really care to play games in early access, just because of the way I play games, where usually I play a game until I finish it, then move on, and so because of that, I just kind of forgot about it. And I had no idea it had a full release, which I think is one of the biggest problems with any early access game, that problem being player retention and potential players just forgetting that the game exists. But that doesn't matter now because I did end up playing this game and here we are today reviewing it. And because I forgot, I will even address the DLC. So, that's a positive. But no more awful jokes, let's actually start with the review, starting with the story. Like a lot of roguelikes, the actual story is told very sparingly throughout the game, with most of the information coming from text found hidden or not so hidden within the levels, with even just level design and world design doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the building of the lore or the world. This approach allowing you to sell a more dark and mysterious game, and that works here with our main character being this dark blob thing that possesses dead bodies in his goal to make it through the game, and of course being a roguelike, every time you die you lose your body and go back to the beginning needing a new one. This really just serves to reset your character, as it's not like there's gonna be a variation in how these characters play, like one being fat and another being athletic. It's always the same. This is definitely already pertaining to the gameplay, but before we move on to that, let me just say that the story is good. It's something to chew on, a small incentive to keep you playing, especially since the story continues well after you beat the game for the first time, much like other popular early access roguelike Hades. And while not nearly as story heavy as that game, there is still recurring characters and more explicit dialogue scenes about the story of the game. But once again, this one being a lot more focused on the mystery and letting you put the pieces back together. And that's enjoyable. Moving on then to the gameplay, where we will start with the basics. Being played in the 2D perspective, you can of course move left to right, but also jump and double jump, dodge roll, grab ledges, and jump down if the type of floor allows it. In this game it can get very vertical at points, even if most of the time it works in that traditional left to right design of most 2D games. But regardless, that's the basic movement, and there is a lot more to it. And I want to talk about it before we talk about the combat, as a lot of the combat is random, which is a thing that's very often in games like this, but these movement upgrades are not. There are specific ways to get them, and they are permanent. They are called runes, and some of them can be incredibly game changing, especially with how late in the game they can show up. These runes are in specific map areas, or as they are called here, biomes. More on that later. And for those movement affecting runes, you have to find them in a certain order, as one ability will unlock a pathway to a previously inaccessible area where the next rune is most likely to be in. For example, the Ram rune allows you to break some specific walls, which allow you to reach an area with a spider rune, which allows you to wall jump, which then leads you to find even more hidden and new areas. Of course, I'm oversimplifying for the sake of this review, as there are other runes in between these two, with the spider rune being one of the last ones you get, but regardless, this way of progression is definitely one of the biggest Metroidvania influences of the game, and how the levels are designed, with later ones having a basic puzzle logic to them, having to unlock something or obtaining a key before you're able to progress. But going back to the runes now, not so much for movement, but they still help you quite a lot in the gameplay in different ways. For example, our next rune, the homunculus rune, which allows you to detach your head from your deceased body while still being attached by a string. In this mode, you simply control the head, and this is an odd upgrade, and it doesn't really fit with the overall fast action gameplay, and it's only really useful a handful of times, and they're mostly story related ones, so it is a bit strange that it's here and that you can do it whenever you want, but it is useful, I guess, in mostly spoilery ways. Then the Vine rune, probably the first rune you'll obtain as you need it to progress in one of the main paths. This one simply allows you to grow a vine plant, allowing you to reach high areas. Very basic, and I think it's mostly here to teach you about the runes when you first start. And I guess that's a good thing that it's simple, because this can be a very dense game to get into, especially blind. But moving on to the next rune, we have the teleportation rune. Pretty self-explanatory. This one allows you to use this monolith spread throughout the levels to teleport to new areas, or maybe just a small hidden bonus room. And this is also the final rune that you actively interact with in the gameplay. The next one is the Explorer's rune, which reveals the map once you've explored most of it. It's very helpful, but not very active. And the last two runes aren't even active at all. And I'm not gonna dive too deep into them because they're very self-explanatory and they serve mostly to add replayability, unlocking new modes. And these are the customization and challenger runes, allowing you to play custom mode, which allows you to create more personalized experience. And you would think you could make an easier game here, and sure you can, but it's surprisingly how most options actually just exist, so you're able to pick very specific types of gameplay and builds without the randomness, like play with only fire-based weapons or only with brutal type weapons, which makes sense for a custom mode. I know I made it sound like it doesn't, it does. I'm just the type of person that likes to use it as a god mode. Regardless, if you don't like making your own game, then you can have the Challenger rune, which unlocks the Daily Challenge, which is a daily challenge mode. I didn't take much advantage of this rune. There is already so much to do in this game, I didn't feel like I needed. But I guess if you've exhausted this game and you just need that tailored challenge, this is for you. But now let's move on to the combat, which is a whole big sack of worms. Starting then with your basic attacks, well, you don't have them, as it depends on what weapons you have equipped, which is random. You have 2 slots for main weapons, and these can vary between types of swords, light and heavy ones, and also ranged weapons like bows with various firing types and firing rates and firing amounts, as you always have infinite ammo, but how much you can fire each time and how long it takes for it to replenish varies. And then shields, which shield you, but can also be used offensively. Most weapons only have one attack though, that being the button that is assigned to whatever slot that they are equipped in a practical way, giving you 2 basic attacks. And these 3 examples really encapsulate most of the weapon types in this game. But like I just mentioned, this is the general rule, but not all weapons abide by it. The main example is the shields that can hold down to defend, but can also just be tapped to attack in a sort of bash attack. But then there is also special weapons that occupy both weapon slot and they have two different attack modes. These are rare and usually pretty high level, which is a transition to talk about the levels of each weapon. As you play, enemies get harder and harder and the weapons found throughout the levels get stronger and stronger compared to your mostly weak beginning weapons. And because of that, there is a big incentive to keep changing weapons during any given run. Each weapon can also have a set of effects like poison or fire or even healing properties, which adds to the consideration when changing weapons and building up your character during a run. And this is good. These two simple things add a lot of thought to the gameplay, and because of just the sheer variety of weapons and effects they can have, it really adds to the choice and possibilities of how your build can go. But to add to that, you're not just limited to two main weapons, of course, you also have two secondary weapons or abilities. These, much like main weapons, are divided into three main groups, but one of these is a bit more of a miscellaneous pile. But first, let's start with the easy ones, grenades and deployable. Grenades being straightforward items, you throw a bomb and most of the times damage happens. That being said, there is a surprising variety of these, with some really cool effects, with some of the rarer ones which I'll refrain from spoiling. This review is mechanically spoilery enough. Then the deployables like various turrets or traps with various types of attacks. It is odd that such a stationary type of attack exists in a mostly fast-paced game, but they can be useful for some scenes where you're being swarmed by a lot of enemies or maybe boss fights. Or maybe you're just simply someone who wants to experience the game slower for whatever reason. And they can be exploited, given their cooldowns are very forgiving, but again, exploiting them in that way would also make the game insanely slow, given their usual low damage output. But I don't want to ramble too much on that. Let's now talk about the sort of final type of secondary attacks. Sort of, because it's attacks and abilities. It's a big mismatch of things like dash attack, a whistle that does damage to the toughest enemy, a map that can only be used once but reveals the entire biome that you are currently in, or a potion that gives you a bonus health, not to be confused with the always equipped health potion that heals you. These are all very different, but they're all under the same umbrella of powers, and that's a good way to describe them, I guess, as it casts a large blanket, but that's fine. I'm glad that this is here. This adds so much variety in these equipables, and much like I said in the main weapons, these have their own levels and rarity and powers, keeping you once again always having to deliberate your build as you go along. Now, what you can find in each run is very random, but there is more to it, and that's what we're going to get into now by addressing what happens at the end of each biome and before the next level, an area that exists usually before boss fights as well, and this is a sort of resting area where you are free from damage and can also do some upgrades. The most simple one is the mutations. There are 4 types of them based on the 3 categories that items can fall into, that being brutality, tactics, and survival, and the 4th mutation being just blank or colorless, that just don't have to do with those 3 types. But what are these types? Well, Red Brutalist focuses on damage and is most prominent in melee weapons, but it is important to say that any of the weapons can be of any of these types. But some weapons definitely fall more often in certain types than others. And of course, there's always just a level of randomness with this game. Then we have the tactics, which is purple and is most prominent in long range weapons and deployables, and survival, which is green and mostly in defensive and health focused items. For reference, the main ways to level up are by finding these capsules with level up paper, is what I'm gonna call it, within the levels, which will give you the choice between 3 or just 2 of the types to level up from, or by collecting pieces of that paper, and once you have all the pieces, the option to level up popping up on the screen. As you level, then you can choose which one of these 3s you want to level up further, and the higher one of them is, then the greater it will be the damage or effects caused by the items of that color type, by extension making other types lower and therefore less viable in later stages of the game. So it is again another aspect to take into consideration when building your character. And going back to the mutations, with that adding to it, you can double down and have a mutation that makes you deal bleeding in your already brutalist build, or maybe go with a tactical mutation like Parting Gift, which makes enemies killed by ranged weapons drop a bomb, making ranged weapons, which in a brutalist build are probably a bit weaker, have a bit more usability. Or you can go with just a neutral one, which can be very compelling with abilities like being able to die once and come back, or doubling all your ammo. There is a lot of choices here, and there will be even more as you unlock more of them throughout the game, but when it comes to mutations, there is a limit. You can only equip so many mutations, and once you reach the limit, you can pay with coin to reset the upgrades. And coin is a great transition to talk about the next feature of these break rooms, so to say, as you get coin killing enemies and also just randomly throughout the levels and in hidden areas. It is a pretty useful, but far from the most useful expendable item in the game, that being the cells. These allow you to upgrade everything, including your own coins, by upgrading how many you start with at the beginning of the game. You can of course do this at these in-between areas and upgrade other stuff like how many times you can use your health flask, or have a random weapon at the beginning of the game, or add the ability to recycle weapons you don't want for gold, or to be able to change and restock a weapons store. The way, brief aside, weapon stores, they're a thing. They can be randomly found throughout the levels and not in these break rooms. But very much like a lot of roguelikes, they can just be mildly useful. Back to the cells though, later on, for insane prices, you can even change how rare your starting gear is, which is one of the most expensive upgrades, but for a reason. But most important, in my opinion, of all, is the unlocking of new weapons and cosmetics. Through the levels, you will find blueprints. This will usually be hidden or dropped by bosses, and these allow you to spend cells to add weapons and items to the rotation of random items in each level or that you get at the beginning. What can also be accessible at the beginning of a run, it's the cosmetics, but I'm not gonna say too much about it because they're just different suits you can wear. They don't do anything, they're purely cosmetics, so I'm not gonna, again, go too deep into it, even if some of them are pretty cool and they're a nice incentive. Anyways, coming back to the weapons though, with rarer ones, it's not only that their blueprints are rarer, but also that they cost a whole lot more of cells to craft. But you do have the incentive to do it, as it is the loop of the game. Play the game, get cells, and spend the cells to have new, better gear, which allows you to get more cells and progress further in the game. But of course, there is one big caveat, and that is when you die, you lose all your cells. This is of course very common of roguelikes, and of course it adds a lot of difficulty to the game, which yes, leads me to talk about that and also the enemies. There is the expected variety of enemies you get in these types of game: flying enemies, lunging enemies, projectile enemies, and enemies with shields being the most prominent ones. But the important thing to say about enemies is that they hit hard and they deal knockback, which might actually be a good thing as it stops you from getting hit twice, but it can also just send you against another enemy, and as the game progresses there'll just be a lot more enemies on screen at once, making it more likely to happen. Or maybe it's just gonna send you falling down a hole, which also takes a big piece of your health, so you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But the enemies hitting you for a lot of life points, of course, also depends a lot on your build. Once again, it's important to keep a balance between damage output and your health. But it's not that simple, as it isn't a case of the red brutalist gives you attack and the green survival gives you health, because that's not how it works. Every upgrade gives you health. It's just that the higher level of one of your types has then a lower percentage of level increase if you choose to continue leveling it up. What this means in practice is that if you focus only on one type, then you're not going to increase your health bar much. And so the idea is that again the game is motivating you towards some balance. But coming back to the difficulty, honestly at first this felt like one of the hardest games I had ever played. And it only gets harder as it goes along, with not only enemies hitting harder but also there being a lot more of them. And then the level design working against you with a lot of holes and traps to fall into. But there is an equilibrium to it. As the game gets harder, you also gain those permanent abilities and also unlock a lot better weapons to be found, lowering that randomness, or at least pulling that randomness more in your favor, which I think is what kept me coming back to this game day after day, because it's legitimately felt as the odds were changing in my favor the more I played. And then there is the stem cells. Cells dropped by the final boss that allow you to raise the difficulty of the game, and yes, you have to get them all to get the true ending. I mean, without spoiling, there is a whole biome hidden until you have all the stem cells. Now, while we're on this topic, let's also mention the bosses, which are okay. They needed more variety, as most of them are big guy with sword. And you know, they are different from each other, but they are still very much big guys with swords. Fix this, honestly, is the DLC bosses, which are, in my opinion, a lot better and more varied, and that's what we're gonna address now. And also try and finishing talking about the gameplay by talking about the biomes, also the DLC, and there is quite a lot of them with very different settings within a very gothic aesthetic, from the deep underground prisons and ruins of a medieval type castle, and the most gothic of all places, a clock tower. And while each run will end on the same place, the path you take to get there can vary a lot, making it a lot easier to replay. It gives it a big edge over most roguelikes that get very repetitive in this specific aspect. And then the DLC, which I usually don't care much for in video games, but here not only does it again add what I think are the better bosses, but also works along with the game in just adding new biomes, and therefore adding more variations in the path that you can take to beat the game, and so adding more replayability. And that's great, honestly. This game is great gameplay wise. It's one of the most satisfying and fast-paced combats I have played in a while, and again, with all the variation and all the systems at play here, it kept me busy for a while in a good way. Regardless, let's now finish this off and talk about the graphics. Once again, very gothic look with dark and dirty scenery for the most part, as there is exceptions for story purposes. The game is done in a pixelized style which looks nice and really masks well the fact that the main character and enemies are 3D characters in a 2D background. But for me the best part is the color and even the lighting, as each biome has a very specific color palette that really matches the mood that it goes for. Who knew there were so many ways to spell out dreadful atmosphere? Now, in more technical terms, I played a little bit of the Switch version, but then I moved to PC, and the reason for that was, while the Switch version is great, running mostly at 60 FPS, only dropping with more intense scenes and never going under 30, at least not in my experience, but then trying the PC version at 144, it is like a different experience. You know, not all games take advantage of running at that high level of frame rates, but Dead Cells is one of them because it is just such a fast-paced gameplay and it just looks so smooth that once I went to PC, I just could not go back to the Switch version, unfortunately. That being said, if you play the Switch version, you're totally good. I don't think you're gonna have a problem either way. Now, moving on to the soundtrack, it's also great, and it's great in a way that it adapts to the situation. These songs really ramp up, and when you're in a tight situation, it really pushes that already intense moment to the next level. It is great, which I have said a lot since the beginning of this review, because this is a great roguelike and a great game, period. And so, because of it, I am now giving Dead Cells an 8 out of 10, but with the DLCs it's a 9 out of 10, because in my opinion it fixes the issues with the bosses and it also adds even more variety to the gameplay in a very organic way. If no one told you, you wouldn't know it's DLC. That's my experience. Now, for recommendations, if you like roguelike games, then yeah, just buy this game with the DLC because it's cheaper than retroactively buying the DLC later, with the game usually going for $25 and $5 for each of the 2 paid DLCs. But going for $30 in a bundle, saving you $5. You know, it's $5, which isn't crazy, but makes one of the DLCs basically free. Now, if you don't like or never tried roguelikes, then I honestly can't say that this is gonna be the one to turn you around on it. Honestly, in your case, I would recommend buying just the base game, maybe, which isn't too expensive for the amount of content you get, just to see if you like it. But again, this isn't the most beginner-friendly roguelike. And honestly, if you've never played a roguelike, then I would probably recommend something more like Hades over this, as I feel that game might be a bit more accessible to newcomers, unless, of course, you are specifically looking for that Metroidvania features, then this might be something you're actually into. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting, all things that you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope that you're having a good day and goodbye.